Hello and welcome to lecture 4 of the Fiat Standard. Today's lecture's topic is fiat mining. Now, as we discussed in the previous lectures, the analog for mining Bitcoin in the fiat system is the issuing of debt. In Bitcoin, you have to solve a proof of work problem, and that allows you to create new Bitcoin tokens, at least for the next century or so, until the entire Bitcoin supply runs out and the supply is fixed. In gold, you have to get advanced equipment, dig into the soil, take out rocks, process them and refine them in order to get gold, purified gold that you could then use as money. Well, in the fiat system, it's different. In the fiat system, the way that new fiat supply comes into existence, bill printing just turns some of the already existing money supply from digital to physical form. I think this is a very key point to keep in mind. It's similar to Bitcoin in that some Bitcoins exist in a physical form. So for instance, if you know the open dimes, the open dime is a USB drive that contains within it its private key. It's, the Bitcoin was not created when the open dime was made. The Bitcoin was created when the new Bitcoin was mined, when a certain block was issued and then a particular amount of Bitcoin reward was issued. Then that creates the Bitcoin. Then you can put it on an open dime and have it in a private key that is embedded in the open dime. And then you can think of it as physical Bitcoin. We can think of paper fiat money as being the equivalent of a physical open dime. The money is created when a bank or a central bank issues a loan. And then the central bank prints a bunch of money, and the treasury, they print a bunch of money and they hand it out to people. In exchange for some of the money that is already created. So you go and you withdraw some of the money from the bank will give you a piece of paper that is physical money. But the printing of the money was not the creation of the money supply. And the creation of debt was the creation of the money supply. So the fiat standards version of gold prospecting or Bitcoin mining is getting others into debt. And I think once you think of it this way, it might just be the most powerful analytical tool of this book, because it is an extremely, extremely powerful idea, and it helps us really understand a lot about how the fiat economy functions and how fiat world works. So there's no effective restraint on mining fiat like with other monetary technologies. So in the case of gold, the restraint is not so much the fact that we can't mine and find a lot of gold. We're always finding more and more gold. Every year gold production goes up. But the restraint on preventing gold from being inflationary is the fact that gold itself does not corrode and does not get consumed. And so the fact that it does not get corroded or consumed means that the stockpile of gold that we have today is the accumulation of thousands of years of gold mining and production. So people have been mining gold for thousands of years. Every year they make slightly more on average because technology advances and we get better at finding gold. And that increase in the production of gold just keeps piling up. And so therefore, no matter how much more gold we produce this year, it's highly unlikely to be a significant increase in the stockpile of gold that has been piling up for thousands and thousands of years. Now, I think there's a little aside here. I think there's a good case to be made that gold is being demonetized now precisely because it is being used in non-monetary uses, because it is being effectively consumed. When we use gold in the production of electronics, or when it is used in non-monetary uses, when it's used in industry in order to make machines, that effectively is monetary gold that's being consumed. It's no longer part of the stockpile, because if you want to use that to settle debt, if you want to use it to turn it into a gold coin or a gold bar, you need to go take it out of that electronic device. So effectively you need to mine it again. So the more industrial uses exist for gold, the less of a monetary metal it is. But this is a little bit of an aside. Now, getting back to fiat, so we see in the case of gold, we have the natural chemistry of gold and the indestructibility that prevent it from becoming too inflationary. In the case of Bitcoin, we have the proof of work difficulty adjustment, where the difficulty of solving the proof of work continues to increase the more people try to mine Bitcoin. That results in the supply not increasing beyond the schedule. So the way that the Bitcoin calibrates the supply creation and ensures that it remains fixed is that the difficulty of mining adjusts upward the more people try to mine. So if more people want to mine Bitcoin, we're still going to get, at current rates, we're still going to get 6.25 Bitcoin every 10 minutes, roughly, regardless of how many people try to mine it. If 10 people are mining Bitcoin around the world, then the difficulty is very low, and we get 6.25 Bitcoin on average every 10 minutes. If 5 billion people want to mine Bitcoin all over the world, the difficulty is going to be very high, and we'll still get about 6.25 Bitcoin every 10 minutes. So how does fiat control its mining? There's no strong effective restraint. There's no algorithmic programmable code that prevents the supply from increasing significantly. There are various political, constitutional, and intellectual safeguards against inflation that have only sporadically, temporarily, and unreliably succeeded in controlling the debt creation underwritten by central banks. So you see, the governments have regulations, rules, and political laws that govern the process of credit creation, but they've not done a very good job. Let's look at it fairly, and we're going to see some numbers now. They've not done a good job to make fiat issuance comparable to Bitcoin's supply growth as it currently is, under 2%, or gold's supply growth, which is under 2%. Realistically, these restraints have led to much higher inflation. So they've not been able to control the debt creation. What has controlled debt creation in the fiat system is the only effective restraint that exists against credit growth spiraling out of control is the inevitable deflationary recessions that are caused by the credit creation and the concomitant collapses in the money supply. And to understand this, I urge you to go back to the Bitcoin Standard, where I discuss the business cycle. And of course, there's a lot of great Austrian literature on the business cycle. The Austrian theory of the business cycle has a credit origin of the business cycle. The business cycle comes about because of credit creation. So when there's an enormous amount of credit creation taking place, that causes an unsustainable boom, and that then results in a crash and a bust, which destroys and wipes out a lot of that credit. That deflationary bust, which is a recession, which is a terrible thing, is really the only restraint that has existed on the production of fiat money. So fiat money is being created at increasing rates generally, but then every few years you get a collapse in the money supply because of these economic recessions that inevitably come about because of the credit creation, and that tames the money supply growth. So it's a very archaic and haphazard process. It's not centrally controlled, it's not programmed, it's not engineering designed. It's just an emergent outcome of the way that fiat money works. The political pressure is always to create more and more money, and the creation of more money leads to the booms, and then that in turn leads to busts. So what are the implications of this mechanism of money creation, this mechanism of mining in the fiat standard? Well, since lending is effectively the mining of new fiat tokens, there is a very strong incentive to issue debt. And the idea really is absolutely astounding when you think about it. In 1912, Mises wrote one of his most famous books, The Theory of Money and Credit, and he summarized the entire book with one sentence. The main conclusion of the whole book was, the expansion of credit cannot form a substitute for capital. It's a very blatantly obvious realization. There's no question about it. If you create more credit, you're not creating more capital. Capital is productive goods that generate other goods. Credit is just a promise to pay somebody money. You can't eat credit. You can't generate goods from credit. So generating more credit is not going to create more productive capital. All that it's going to do is generate more claims on the already existing capital. So this should be basically obvious to anybody, I'd say, whose IQ is over 90. You have to be extremely, extremely thick to not understand this very basic concept. If you issue, think about it as a football stadium. In order to increase the capacity of a football stadium, you need to add more chairs. If you issue more tickets, which is what credit is, it's a promise to provide somebody with a chair. If you issue more tickets for the football stadium, you're not going to increase the football stadium capacity. You're going to create a large number of people that expect to have a seat but then can't find a seat. And that's really what the business cycle is. It's the creation of more promises for capital, and then people going about their business thinking that they have more capital available to them than they actually have. And then once the economic reality becomes apparent to them, it becomes clear to them that there aren't enough resources to meet all of their businesses' needs, and then the credit market collapses and you get a recession, and most of these businesses have to be liquidated.
The Bitcoin Standard podcast is brought to you by thesafehouse.com, my independent publisher and bookshop, selling the best Bitcoin books in high-quality cloth hardcovers built to last for generations. Most books these days are pretty fiat. They're flimsy and they fall apart quickly, and I did not want that for my books, so I set up the Safe House especially to provide you with beautiful, long-lasting classic cloth hardcovers you can proudly pass down for generations. You can get copies of my 3 books, The Bitcoin Standard, The Fiat Standard, and Principles of Economics, and you can also get copies of Lynn Alden's Broken Money, Parker Lewis's Gradually Then Suddenly, and Matthew Lysiak's Fiat Food, to which I contributed a few chapters, and Mexican billionaires Ricardo Salinas Pliego's new book, The Bitcoin Enlightenment. We now offer bulk discounts so you can buy books for yourself and for the friends and family you'd like to learn about Bitcoin. Buy any 2 books for $50, any 5 books or more for $20 per book, and for more than 50 books, it's only $15 per book. Go to thesafehouse.com, the SAIF house.com, where you can get all of these books in high-quality cloth hardcovers, delivered worldwide, and get 10% off for paying with Bitcoin. The Bitcoin Standard podcast is brought to you by the Daylight Computer. I love to work early in the morning and late at night, or in the sun outdoors, but regular computer screens are terrible at these times, and they strain your eyes. For years, I've wanted a paper-like electronic screen on a simple computer I could use to write. I tried several models, but none were very good. Now, finally, Daylight have delivered a fantastic full-function tablet with a paper-like screen that's easy on your eyes and great for outdoor use. I've been using the Daylight Computer to write my next book, and it is absolutely fantastic, and it has led me to invest in this company myself. Check out my interview with Anjan Kata in episode 249.
So the fiat system is just putting this process on steroids. The fiat system makes this process extremely, extremely lucrative. Everybody wants to issue more debt. And so as a result of this, we see this reflected across all kinds of things. If you look around you in the fiat world, you see people don't buy goods from savings. People don't buy their home by taking their savings into their house and but taking their savings to the person that they want to buy the house from and giving to them. You borrow in order to buy a house, and that makes sense because when you borrow to buy a house, your bank is able to create more fiat. Your bank is effectively mining fiat. So when you pay with your own $1 million, you're just taking your own $1 million and you're paying for the house. When you go and you borrow $1 million from the bank is creating a new $1 million. So obviously there's a huge incentive for the bank to do this. And so of course they're going to make the house deal for you much sweeter than if you pay for it. So when you think about the implications of this, yes, even with the interest that you have to pay for borrowing for the house, you're going to come out ahead because of the benefit of inflation. Because in reality, the bank is able to create the new $1 million, and you're going to pay them back those $1 million over 30 years, but they're not having to put up real capital. There's no opportunity cost for them. They don't have to take $1 million out of their own savings, out of their own bank accounts cash balance, out of other depositors' cash balance. They don't have to take out all of these in order to pay for your house. They're just making new money. So clearly they can cut you a nicer deal. And that's why your house will be cheaper if you buy it on credit, because over 30 years' time, even though you're going to pay it with interest, almost certainly the interest is not going to be as high as the inflation rate. So you benefit from getting into the debt, and the bank benefits from you getting into the debt. And that's really why I think everybody buys everything on credit in the fiat system. But it doesn't just stop with individuals. If you look at companies, that's what they do. You look at companies, they're always borrowing to finance their expenses because, again, every time they borrow, new money is being created. In fact, if you look at businesses, what they do is most businesses are essentially in the business of banking. You start off your business selling goods and services to people, but then The most successful strategy, which you see happening all over the US economy in particular, which is the most financialized and most advanced fiat economy, is to turn your business into a bank and turn your customers into depositors at the bank and borrowers from your bank, specifically not depositors, but borrowers. So you see this, that all companies issue their own credit cards. Now, why should a clothes company that sells clothes issue a credit card? It seems like it's a good deal. If you buy clothes from this company, you get the credit card, you get a decent discount perhaps on their clothes, you get special deals and offers. But what's in it for them? Why? It's not just a loyalty program. They could issue loyalty programs where you get 5% back on every $100 that you issue. But the point is not just loyalty programs. These are separate from their loyalty programs. The point is to make you into a borrower. So if they give you a credit card, if you pay off your credit card at the end of the month, you don't have to pay them any interest. But not everybody's going to pay off all of their credit card at the end of every month. A lot of people are going to be late on their payments, and they're going to be charged an interest rate. And they don't have to necessarily be late on the payment. It's not like they're missing a payment. They're going to make the minimum payment, and they're going to roll over the credit to the next month. So when you roll over the credit, you have to pay an interest rate on it. What interest rate do they charge on their credit card? Something like 20%, 24% or so. But how much do these corporations have to pay to borrow? What is the interest rate at which they borrow? 2%, 5%, 8%, something like that. So they borrow at a very low rate, and they're able to lend their customers at a very high rate. And you see this across all kinds of businesses. So Macy's, the clothes business, before it went bankrupt, it was making more revenue from lending to its customers. Its credit card program was making more revenue than it was making from its department stores selling clothes. And you see this happening all over. You see all kinds of businesses turn into credit businesses, because the bigger you are as a business, the more you're able to borrow. The more you're able to borrow at a lower interest rate, and the lower interest rate you can borrow at. And then the more you can turn over that debt to your customers at a higher interest rate, and then have them pay the high interest rate. And so you see this everywhere. Whatever your company does, it makes sense for you to turn it into a bank. And this is the over-financialization of the US economy. And I think we can only understand this properly when we understand that issuing new fiat tokens is issuing new debt. And this, of course, doesn't stop with private companies. It's also true for governments. Governments also do the same thing. Governments also need to issue debt, because issuing debt is very beneficial for them. They're able to make money, and the more they borrow, the more money they are creating. And so every time you're creating money, you're diluting everybody else's money, and you benefit from it. So it's true for the individual, it's true for private companies, and it's true for government entities, local governments, and national governments. They all do the same thing. And even international organizations like the IMF, they all benefit from issuing more and more debt, because the more debt they issue, the more money they are making. And that's why everybody is in debt. Individuals, governments, everyone in the world today is practically in debt. The more debt you get into, the more money you are creating, and the more inflation you're creating. The fiat standard leaves all of society's wealth and its monetary and financial system vulnerable to the central banks, reckless monetary central planning, and the shenanigans of individual financial institutions. So all of the money that everybody uses, and remember in the previous lecture, in lecture 3, when we discussed how the fiat standard works, remember we're mixing the functions of trade, saving, and banking, and international trade, domestic banking. We're putting all of these functions together with one entity that is able to lend to the government. So we're effectively holding everybody's money hostage, and we're holding everybody's savings and wealth as collateral to allow everybody else to borrow. So we're making everyone borrow and everyone dilute the savings of everybody else. And of course, the winners in this are the people who borrow the most, and the losers are the people who don't borrow, or who borrow the least. And of course, the winners are the ones who are able to borrow at the lowest interest rate, not the ones who are able to borrow at the high interest rates. And so everyone is forced to use the same inflationary monetary asset, leaves everyone vulnerable to its failure, and makes the financial system as strong as its weakest link. Everybody has to deal with the same monetary system, the same payment rails, the same banking system. And that banking system is constantly being devalued through more and more printing. And it's constantly being weakened systematically by its weakest links engaging in destructive lending behavior. So everybody's constantly having their savings devalued by everybody else. And the winners are the ones who borrow and lend the most. And so this really puts society in this, what I call the fiat cycle, which is what fiat economies have been going through for decades. First, we begin with inflation. Usually inflation is presented as a kind of good idea, as a necessary thing because of some nice goal. And we saw this in the second chapter. We saw this in the case of England and World War One. In World War One, the English, it seemed like a great idea. We're just going to do some inflation because we're going to fight the war, and it's very necessary for us to fight the war. And so inflation happens, and then that leads to a boom. People think that they're wealthier than they are. We can afford to fight a war, and there are no costs to it. But then, of course, the boom turns into a bust. There's a recession that comes after that. And the recession leads to a deflation. There's a collapse in the money supply. And deflation leads to political pressure to reflate. So really, the vast majority of modern economics, mainstream economists, are concentrated into two groups: the inflationists and the reflationists. The inflationists are the people who want to create inflation for what they view as good causes. We want the economy to become richer. We want to build hospitals. We want to fight foreigners. We want to build infrastructure. They have all these nice sob stories about why inflation is good, and they rationalize inflation. That's where the Keynesians come in. That's when your average run-of-the-mill Keynesian economist is. The entirety of modern Keynesian economics is just about finding stupid excuses for why the government needs to print money. So we start off with the inflationary pressure. That leads to a boom. That then leads to a bust. That then leads to deflation. That's where the other branch of economists comes in, the smaller group of economists. So the majority of economists are Keynesians. If you look at, I'd say, your average American university, something like 90% of the economists are Keynesians, and about 10% are monetarists. And these monetarists, they aren't very keen on the inflation in the first place, or at least they don't fixate on it too much. But they're very keen on the reflation, and that's why they're very popular. Because what they say is, in the entirety of their worldview, and all of that is built on the work of Milton Friedman and his ridiculous history of money in the United States, which I discuss in detail in the Bitcoin Standard and also allude to in this chapter. The whole thing is built on the idea that the reason there was a depression in the 1930s was because the US government and the Federal Reserve allowed the money supply to contract. And if they'd only stopped the money supply from contracting, then they would have prevented the depression from happening. So once the deflation happens, that's when the monetarists come in, and they do all kinds of voodoo math to convince you that what we need is more inflation. We need to reflate the bubble, bring the bubble back. And so they call for more inflation, which then leads to another boom, which then leads to another bust, and then we get another deflation. So the entire spectrum of allowable opinion within modern mainstream economics that is taught at universities and published in fiat universities and fiat newspapers and fiat media is whether we should be inflating more or we should be reflating more. But there's never really any questioning of whether inflation itself is a good thing or a bad thing. As a result of this dynamic, we see how the money supply works, how the money supply growth happens, how fiat mining really ends up working in the aggregate. If you look at figure 3 in the book, we see that the broad money supply growth rate for the 4 countries that have had the lowest supply growth rate. So if we're picking, these are the 4 best poster children for fiat monetary system. This is the least inflation that you're going to get. Switzerland, the USA, Sweden, and Denmark. These 4 countries that have had the lowest average money supply growth over the last 60 years, from 1960 to 2020. If you look at their money supply growth, you see that it has basically oscillated quite significantly. It varies from usually between 0 and 12% per year. Sometimes it goes as low as -10 and as low as almost -18. And sometimes it goes up more than 20%. But it's usually between 0 and 10%. That's how the average supply grows. So whereas with Bitcoin, you remember the growth in the supply is constantly declining very predictably. With gold, we have a constant growth rate of around 1.5%, as discussed in the Bitcoin standard. With fiat, we have this haphazard system of spikes up and spikes down happening all the time, even in the best case scenario. And of course, if we were to look at the other countries, we'll see much more violent volatility. We'll see the money supply contracting by 20, 30% sometimes, and then going up by 30, 40, 50, maybe 100% at certain points. So the lowest average growth rates between 1960 and 2020 is 6.5% for Switzerland, 7.4% for the US, 7.9% for Sweden, and 8.2% for Denmark. That's as low as it gets. Those are the 4 countries that have had the lowest supply growth rate. So compare that to Bitcoin, which is currently at around 1.8%, and gold, which has been at around 1.5% to 2% for the last century or so. This is as good as fiat gets. So not only is it highly volatile, as we see here, it's also very high. As good, the best that we can get is this much. But of course, the numerical average for the whole world's currencies between 1960 and 2020 is around 30%. If you do a weighted average for the growth, where the value of each currency's growth is weighed by the size of the currency and the market capitalization of the currency, then you get something like 14%. In other words, the average fiat user has witnessed a 14% dilution of their fiat holdings over the past 60 years on average. And 14% per year means basically a 50% loss in value in 5 years. So looking at the track record, the average fiat user has had 50% dilution of their supply in every 5 years. I mentioned the monetarists and the fear of deflation and the need to constantly reflate the economy. This kind of fear of deflation has gotten to pathological levels amongst modern fiat economists, where they don't just fear deflation, the deflationary crash that happens after the inflationary bust. They're not just afraid of, having another depression happen because of a banking crisis, which then requires us to print more money. The phobia of deflation has gone to the insane lens where now the simple growth in productivity, which is the decline in prices, is viewed as a dangerous thing by your average fiat economist, which is absolutely hilarious. So they're not just worried about deflationary recessions, they're worried about productivity deflation, which is just economic growth. In other words, they think that the prices dropping by 1% or 2%, the average price level, what they call the average price level, which we're going to see is a very deeply problematic concept, but they think that this price level dropping a little bit is a massive cause for concern, which is hilarious. And in their mind, the idea, the Keynesian idea, if you've had the misfortune of studying a Keynesian textbook, you'll hear why deflation is bad. They'll tell you deflation means that the price of goods declines over time, and therefore people will stop spending money because they will just expect their money to go up in value over time. And so therefore, because they stop spending money, the economy comes to a grinding halt. We get more unemployment, and then people lose incomes, and then they start spending less, and that just puts the economy in a recessionary, deflationary cycle. So they conflate the deflation that's caused by the inflationary boom with the deflation that happens because of productivity growth. And so therefore, they end up believing that productivity growth is a bad thing. And I think this is absolutely insane, and it's just another indicator that you can't take modern economists seriously at all. You cannot even consider that they have anything useful to say, because this isn't by any stretch of the imagination a reasonable thing to believe. And my favorite example for this is, let's look at the computer industry. In 1980, 42 years ago, if you wanted to buy a computer hard drive, if you wanted to buy an external hard drive, it cost around $3,500 to buy a 1 megabyte hard drive. Today, you can buy for something like $50, you can buy a 1 terabyte hard drive. I haven't bought one in a while, so my pricing is off, but it's in that range. You buy 1 terabyte, and a terabyte is 1 million megabytes. So you buy 1 million times the storage for about 1% of the price. So the price of a megabyte of data for storage has gone down by 100 million fold in these 40 years. And yet, in spite of the fact that the price is going down so significantly, we don't see people not buying hard drives. People were buying hard drives in the 80s. They bought them in the 90s. They bought them in the 2000s, and they keep buying them today. And even though today, you can buy a 1 terabyte hard drive for about $30 or $40, you still buy it, even though you know that if you just wait 5 years, it's going to be worth maybe $1. So why don't you just wait? Why didn't people in the 1980s wait until today, and then they could have gotten their 1 megabyte for practically nothing? You can buy 1 megabyte of data for close to zero today. Why don't people in 1980 just wait until today? That's the question that Keynesians cannot answer. And of course, they are unable to engage in any kind of honest debate because they write the textbooks, they review their own economics. You can't get into academia and have a successful career if you point out these obvious blatant facts to these clowns. And they continue to just believe that a drop in prices is destructive for the economy. And they fail to explain how the computer tech industry has witnessed such crushing deflation over the past decades and continues to grow. So the people who bought a 1 megabyte drive in 1980, that was probably what Steve Jobs was buying at that time. Steve Jobs was one of the people who was spending $3,500 on a 1 megabyte hard drive in around 1980. Why did he do that? Why didn't he wait? If he was so smart, why didn't he just wait 10 years and then he could have had it for 1% of the price? The answer is that hard drive at that time was worth more than $3,500 for him. So it doesn't matter that he could wait 40 years and get it for a penny. At that time, in 1980, the marginal productivity of adding that hard drive to his computer allowed him to become more productive. And it allowed him to become more productive more than the tune of $3,500. So by having that hard drive, he was able to build the software that would later become Apple, and it generated billions and billions of dollars of value for him and for other shareholders of Apple because he was able to invest in that thing. So the reason you buy something is because it's worth more than the money that you have today, and you're not going to deny yourself everything just because it can be cheaper tomorrow. The reason that you eat food today is because it's worth more to you than the money that is in your pocket. It's insignificant for you if you could wait a year and get the food cheaper, because if you don't buy the food today, you're going to starve in that year, and then in a year later when the food is cheaper, you're not going to be able to afford it. So people don't spend just because they expect their money to decline in value. People spend because they need to consume things and because they value those things more than the value of the money that they have. That's just how an economy works. And it's an amazing fact that economists, the vast majority of modern economists, don't get this. It's astonishing, truly. So if you're buying a capital good, you buy it if the marginal productivity of that good is higher than the price that you pay for it. So if you buy that hard drive, if having that hard drive allows you to make more money than the price of the hard drive, you buy it and you don't care about what's going to happen to its price in the future because it's still going to be profitable for you to get it. And the same is true for consumption goods. If you value the consumption good more than the money that you have, you're going to get it. People are not going to starve. People are not going to go homeless. People are not going to go naked because they expect that food, houses, and clothes will be more affordable in a year or two. That's just insane. The Bitcoin Standard podcast is brought to you by CoinKite. CoinKite are my favorite makers of Bitcoin hardware. They produce the legendary Open Dime, the first Bitcoin bearer asset, as well as the reliable Cold Card hardware wallet, the excellent stainless steel seed plates for storing your seed phrases, and the block clock. Now, CoinKite have produced the Sats card, a card the size of a credit card which can store Bitcoin and works great as a gift. CoinKite have just produced a limited edition gorgeous Bitcoin Standard Sats card, which carries the Bitcoin Standard logo, and you can get it from coinkite.shop/Bitcoin Standard. Use the code Bitcoin Standard to get 5% off your purchase. This podcast is also brought to you by the Bitcoin Way, your professional Bitcoin IT team offering you personalized, secure, and comprehensive solutions for every step along your Bitcoin journey. The Bitcoin Way offer live concierge service to guide you with your Bitcoin cold storage, running your node, privacy best practices, inheritance planning, corporate strategy, and multi-sig solutions.
They don't touch your coins, they guide you through the process of acquiring your coins and securing them. If you'd like to make your setup safer and more reliable, book a consult with them and see what they have to suggest. If you want to give someone the gift of Bitcoin, get them this professional service that will ensure they start off knowing exactly how to manage their coins and not lose them. Go to thebitcoinway.com and start Bitcoining more confidently.
So, the ability to buy more goods in the future does not stop people from consuming in the present. Time preference is always positive, and people always prefer having something in the present to having it in the future. This is the key thing to understand. You'd rather have the house today and live in the house today than have the house tomorrow. You'd rather eat today than eat tomorrow because you don't want to go hungry all day today. Humans need to eat to survive, and most expect decent shelter, clothing, and other consumer goods, and so they consume. And if you don't consume those things, you won't be around tomorrow to benefit from the deflation. So, in a sane economy, people consume because they value the things that they buy more than the money that they have. In an insane Keynesian economy, what the Keynesians want you to believe is that the only reason anybody consumes, the only reason you can have a business, the only reason you can work for other people, to provide value for other people, is if the Keynesians destroy the money that other people have and then force those people to spend it on anything. Now, the Keynesians are correct in that their idiotic monetary policy does cause people to spend more. That it does raise people's time preference. When you can't expect your money to hold on to its value to the future, you will spend it on any stupid nonsense that you can get today, because most stupid nonsense is better than your national currency for most people. You know, if we say the average over the last 60 years was 14%, well then for most people it makes sense to buy anything whose supply and degradation doesn't add up to about 14%. So people will buy stupid nonsense that they don't need. And you see this all around us. People are constantly buying so much. But that's what creates the mass consumer society. That's what creates a society in which people mindlessly consume and are constantly buying more things. And it's in the delicious irony that the same idiots who tell you that we need to destroy the currency in order to have an economy, in order to have consumption, they are also usually the same kind of idiots who tell you that the problem with capitalism is that capitalism causes so much consumption, and the problem with capitalism is that we're over-consuming and we need people to stop consuming. They don't see the connection here. The reason people consume so much, the reason we live in such a consumerist society, is because the money is broken and people can't save, and so people have to keep spending their money. And if we didn't break the money with stupid Keynesian monetary policy, we would have a functioning money that would work as a saving mechanism, and people could use it as a saving mechanism and hold on to their savings into the future. And as a result, people would still spend money, but they would spend money on things that they need rather than stupid things that they don't need. And instead of buying stupid things that they don't need, they'd keep savings, which would allow them a secure future. That's what savings do. They allow you security for your future. So deflation will likely cause people to reduce frivolous consumption, but they will consume nonetheless. And whatever they do not consume will be saved or invested, providing demand for goods in the future. This is the other side of the story, which Keynesians so conveniently ignored, that when you save money, you're not just destroying economic value, as they tend to think. You're saving it into the future, and then in the future, you're going to spend it. And in the present, if people weren't subject to insane Keynesian criminal monetary policy in the past, they would have saved a lot more in the past, and they would have a lot more to be spending today. So we don't need to be destroying the currency for them today to spend. In other words, the market for money does not need inflation in order to function. And it is purely government propaganda to suggest this. And that's really why Keynesians are nothing more than just government court jesters that give the government the propaganda it wants to justify the inflation it wants to create. So this then brings us to the issue of price inflation. Well, what does this fiat monetary system mean for prices? Fiat economists are obsessed with a ridiculous measure called the CPI, or the Consumer Price Index. And the Consumer Price Index is a way of supposedly measuring the change in the value of the currency or the rate of inflation. And the fundamental scam here is the idea that the Keynesians have successfully repackaged the term inflation from its original correct meaning, which is inflation is an increase in the money supply. You inflate something, you make it bigger. And so when you make the money supply bigger, you're inflating the money supply. That's the original sane meaning of the term. Inflation refers to the increase in the money supply. They've appropriated that term to mean a rise in prices. And that's linguistically incorrect, because prices don't inflate, they don't get bigger, prices rise. So they've appropriated it to mean price inflation, and that means that you can now measure price inflation using this ridiculous construct called the CPI, the Consumer Price Index. So how do you make the Consumer Price Index? How do you come up with this mechanism for measuring prices? Well, the way that they do it is, of course, it's a measurement that has no units, which is why it is completely meaningless. If you're going to be measuring something, you need a definable, constant unit that is a frame of reference against which you can measure things. The CPI is a measure that has no unit, so it's not a measure. It's just a ridiculous number pulled out of thin air. So if you want to measure length, you need the centimeter or the inch or the meter or the kilometer. That's a set unit that allows you to compare things. If you want to measure volume, you use the centimeter cubed or the meter cubed. If you want to measure weight, you use the kilogram or the pound or any of these units. These units are clearly definable. And if I tell you something weighs 20 kilograms, you understand exactly what that thing weighs and you can compare it to something else. CPI is just a percentage. It has no unit. So first of all, it's completely invalid because it has no unit. So you're not measuring anything. You're measuring an increase in what? And it's a 4% what? 4% of what is the increase. And the fact that you're measuring something without a unit is what allows them to get away with the intellectual dishonesty and the absurdity and the fundamental flaw of the CPI, which is that the composition of the basket of goods itself is a function of prices, which is a function of the value of the dollar. And therefore, it cannot serve as a measuring rod for the value of the dollar. What they're doing is they're trying to measure the change in the value of the dollar by measuring the prices of goods. But the prices of goods are a function of people buying and selling those goods, and people's purchasing decisions are also a function of the dollar itself. In other words, you're measuring something with itself. It's a tautology. It's like trying to measure an elastic band with the elastic band itself. Well, if the elastic band itself is expanding and contracting, then measuring it with another elastic band that is similarly expanding and contracting is meaningless. And you can arrive at any number you want because you can stretch either of the elastic band in any way that you want and get the measurement that you want. And that's basically how the CPI functions. And realistically, the way that this allows them to do is that they can just simply change the composition of the goods in the basket of goods, and they can get whatever measure that they want. And more concretely, what this allows us to do is it hides the fact that as the prices of goods increase, so if the money supply increases, the amount of dollars in circulation goes up, then the price of goods increases. Now, how do people react? Do the goods and services that people buy also increase by the same magnitude? No, they can't increase by the same magnitude because people's incomes don't keep up with inflation. And so what do? They make do with inferior products. If you are buying something, if you usually buy beef and that's your daily, let's think you buy, say, $10 worth of beef every day, and you have $10 income, you buy $10 of beef every day. Now, if there's hyperinflation and money is printed and your income stays at $10, but the price of beef goes up to $50. Well, what are you going to do? Are you still going to buy the $50 worth of beef? And if you could buy the $50 worth of beef, we'll see the CPI reflecting a 5-fold increase in the price index. But you can't. You only have $10. So you're going to buy $10 worth of beans or soy instead of the beef. And therefore, what happens to your consumer price index? It's constant. There is no inflation. There is no inflation because you substituted the beef with soy. And now that you're eating soy, your basket of goods is still worth $10. That's what the CPI fundamentally hides. That's why the CPI is built to understate real price inflation, because people have to substitute. And this is why the ridiculous idea of a unitless measure is so useful for fiat economists here, Because since it's a unitless measure, you're stretching the rubber band to give you the reading that you want. People are changing their consumer basket of goods as a result of inflation, and that's understating the extent of the rise in prices. And in fact, in the 1970s, when inflation started to become a serious problem in the United States after the closing of the gold window with the installation of the Fiat Standard, the way that the CPI was reduced, and this has been discussed in detail recently, is that they just kept taking out the goods whose prices were going up from the CPI. By the time Arthur Burns was done with it, he had eliminated about 65% of the goods in the CPI, including food and oil and energy-related products. So food and oil and energy, the essentials that everybody needs to consume, had been removed from the CPI because their prices were going up too much and they were giving us very high readings of the CPI. By removing them from the basket of goods and focusing the basket of goods on the goods whose prices don't rise extensively, you can get a very low inflation rate. And that's how the Fiat Standard has succeeded in convincing people that inflation is not a big problem. People's quality of their food and their energy continues to degrade, and the benefits of productivity increase are understated and hidden away. And they think that inflation is only going up at 2-3%, and they think that that's just the rate of inflation. But in reality, look at the price of the goods that people actually desire, and you'll see that they're going up at a much higher rate. And of course, another very major important point in the way that this functions is that the fiat system has basically removed houses from being consumer goods, and they consider it an investment good. So now if people have to use their house as an investment good, then the price of their house going up is viewed as an increase in household wealth, when really it's not an increase in household wealth, it's an increase in the cost of housing. Your house is just becoming more expensive, so people who want to buy houses now have to pay a higher price. But housing is removed from the CPI. So you remove homes, you remove food, you remove oil, what are you left with? You're left with mostly industrial goods that are produced at very high scale, at very high productivity, and whose prices generally decline with time because of increases in productivity. And so the CPI ends up massively understating the extent of price inflation. In order to really understand how inflation actually works, I think the most brilliant framework for thinking about it is Michael Saylor's brilliant explanation of inflation as a vector. And in mathematics, a vector is a series of numbers rather than a single unit, a scalar number. So CPI wants you to believe that inflation is just a number. You know, it's 3% or 7% or 2% or 5%. But that's meaningless because it's a number that depends entirely on the composition of goods that you put into the basket of goods. Well, if you look more closely, you'll see that this basket of goods, all the goods in the basket of goods, aren't changing uniformly. If inflation reads 5%, that doesn't mean that all the goods in the basket of goods are increasing at 5%. It means that some goods are going up at 10%, some are going up at 0%, some are going up at 30%, some are declining at 5%. And then you pick and choose whatever goods you want to include in the basket, and then you end up with the number that you think works best for the politicians that pay your salaries. That's essentially what the Bureau of Labor Statistics does. But if you were to think about it as a vector, and you have a vector of numbers, several numbers for each good, then you can start seeing clearly where the inflation is going. There is no universal inflation rate that measures increases in the prices of all goods and services, as inflation affects different goods in different ways. If inflation is considered as a vector, wherein each good has its own price inflation rate, it becomes far easier to identify the impacts of inflation on individuals and their provision for the future. So let's think about what it is that makes certain goods go up in price as a response to monetary inflation, whereas other goods don't go up in price. I think we can identify certain properties of goods that make them sensitive to price inflation and others that are not. For instance, goods that are abundant, that are not highly sought after, and that require a low variable cost of production will witness the least price appreciation. For instance, digital and information goods involve a variable cost of production that is very close to zero, so their prices don't go up. Think about the cost of hard drives. As I mentioned earlier, in 1980, you could get a 10 megabyte hard drive for $3,000. Today, 10 megabytes of data, you can buy them for less than a cent, for a tiny fraction of a cent. And so the price of data, the price of storage continues to go down. The price of TVs continues to go down. The price of computers, cell phones, all these technologies continue to get cheaper to make every year because of the nature of these technologies. The majority of the cost of these technologies is in the research. And once the research has been finalized and the design has been finalized, then popping out more of them is pretty trivial, relatively. It's just a bunch of plastics and silicone and sand, and you process them and you turn them into those machines. There's not much of a restraint on how much silicon, sand, and coal can go into the making of these machines. And so, as a response to inflation, the supply of these goods can be increased to meet the increased demand resulting from increased inflation, as people spend more and more of their money because they have more money and because they don't want to hold on to their money because they think its value will go down. So a TV or a computer becomes a better investment than holding on to cash, because you can use it and it'll hold on to its value better than cash in many cases. So digital goods, information goods, we won't see much inflation. Another way of thinking about it is, think about a company like Google. Sailor uses this example. If everybody in Google didn't turn up for work tomorrow, if they spend a whole month not turning up to work, Google will still work. Your Gmail account will still work. Most of the services of Google will still work. That stuff is pretty much on autopilot. It'll be several weeks before you notice anything go wrong from people not turning up to work. The people that are working right now are not working on the current services, which are basically on autopilot. They're working on the future services. So if they don't turn up today to work, then you're going to see the difference in a few weeks. You're going to see the difference in a few years when you don't see more Google features, when you see Google slow down, when you see more problems pile up. But as it currently stands, in order to operate Google, very little human labor is required. And so therefore, that's another way of thinking about why it's not very price sensitive. Google, YouTube, Facebook, they can ramp up their services. Facebook doesn't charge customers, but they can ramp up their services. They can increase, they can scale, they can double the number of users without incurring significant monetary costs. So they could double their revenue while their expenditures may only go up a tiny percentage. So these kind of goods don't witness a lot of price inflation. And you'll notice these things get featured heavily in the CPI because they make the CPI look good. And so one nice trick that is pulled by many governments around the world, I know they do this in the US, is to include the deflationary drop in the price of electronics in the calculations of inflation. In other words, if your foods have become more expensive by 10%, but your electronics got cheaper by 10%, then these kind of wash out. These kind of cancel each other out. So your electronics getting cheaper by 10% obviously is not because they are cheaper. It's a better technology. So the new TV or the new computer is 20% faster than the old computer, but it's only 5% more expensive. So therefore, it's actually 15% faster. That's kind of roughly how they calculate it. So as your computer gets faster, that means that you're benefiting from deflation. And according to the insane Keynesians, central banks need to fight that by making your food more expensive. Because if your food's not more expensive while your computers become cheaper, then your level of spending will drop and then the economy will be in crisis. This is exactly how these crazy people think. I'm not making this up. Your ability to afford more electronics necessitates that government make essentials more expensive for you. Another example is industrial goods that can be produced at scale. These experience price inflation to some extent, albeit not very high. Industrial food is the best example of this. So industrial food requires little natural ingredients to go into it. It requires just a lot of industrialization and a lot of high-tech production techniques. And these things can scale pretty well. You can ramp up the production of these things quite easily. So as demand for these goods increases, it becomes relatively straightforward for the producers to make more and more of them without bringing the price up a lot. Again, you'll notice that these things also feature very heavily in your CPI. And so when the price of meat and fresh produce becomes expensive, the price, because these things require a lot of manual input in order to produce them and make sure that they're healthy and grown properly. That's not the case with industrial foods. And that's why you'll see that more and more in the CPI, the focus is on these industrial poisonous foods because they continue to stay cheap. Think about the price of a can of Coke or a bag of Doritos. That doesn't keep up with inflation. It goes up at a much lower rate than inflation. Not coincidentally, the same governments that benefit from the inflation have spent the last 50 years telling their poor peasants that they would be better off eating this industrial waste that's very cheap than eating the nutritious food that all their family have eaten for many, many decades. I don't think that's a coincidence, and we're going to discuss this in a lot of detail in the chapter on fiat food. It's no coincidence that as fiat made food more expensive, somehow, suddenly, the criminal mafia that is government-financed nutrition science came to the conclusion that, oh wait, actually, now that healthy food has become more expensive, guess what? The human body has somehow magically been transformed to thrive on cheap industrial waste rather than nutritious food. So organically farmed produce, fine dining, these things become more and more expensive. Go into a restaurant where you get an actual waiter to come and serve you, that becomes more and more expensive with time, because buying that waiter's time just continues to go up as the price of money declines. Whereas industrial food, highly processed food with no service or very little service, automated production, that doesn't go up a lot. So that's one thing, the degree to which there's industrialization versus hand work, manual labor involved is one way in which you can see the inflation. Another one, I think, is the scarcity. Things that are scarce, that are not easy to find, they are most price sensitive to inflation, whereas things that are very abundant are not. And this is very common sense. So house prices will appreciate faster than the prices of industrial products because it's easy to make more industrial products. It's difficult to make more houses. It's expensive and it's time consuming. And because of regulations and zoning, it's usually difficult to build more houses. So therefore, houses will spike in price much more than easy to produce industrial goods. Within property and within houses, property in desirable areas will increase in price at rates that exceed official CPI measures. Things like healthcare, tuition in desirable schools and universities, and luxury goods. These things go up in price faster than CPI. So the things that you want that are scarce, status goods, or the things that are really helpful in helping you advance further in life, good tuition in a good school or a good university, these things are very difficult to come across because they're scarce. There's only a limited number of people that can get into Harvard every year. And so when the value of the money declines and when all those people have more money in their pocket because of inflation, the only way that Harvard can ration and allocate these spots is through raising the price. And the only way that they can afford to continue to offer the services that they do is through rationing the price. Probably universities here are a bad example because arguably universities today are like junk food more than healthy food. But for the people who still value them as useful goods, you could think about it from this perspective. And the majority of people still do, and that's why the price of universities still increases so rapidly, which I think is massively unsustainable. But that's a topic for another day. So but the most important way in which we see the inflation, this is something that Michael Saylor pointed out, is that it shows up in the cost of purchasing financial assets that yield income for the future. The best way to think about how inflation impoverishes people is to think about the cost of saving for your future. It used to be, if you had an interest rate of 5%, then if you saved up $1 million, you worked for 30 years, you saved up $1 million, you put them in government bonds, you'd get 5% per year. So you could retire and buy a 30-year bond that yields 5% and expect to be making 5% a year for 30 years. So that's about $50,000. $50,000 is enough for somebody to retire on. You have your house, you've worked, and you just need a little bit of pocket money for your retirement. You save up to $1 million and then you retire and you've got $50,000 a year. Well, that's the case when interest rates are at 5%. But what happens when interest rates are at 0.5%? Well, now your $1 million of saving will only buy you $5,000 of yield every year. So in order to actually retire with $50,000 of spending, you need to now save $10 million. So as inflation increases, the amount of money that you need to save for retirement goes up. The amount of money that you need to save in order to make a certain amount of yield in the future goes up. And that's really how inflation has stolen people's futures. It used to be attainable to save for retirement. It used to be possible to save because you would work and you would put your savings in reliable stores of value, and they would beat inflation, and then you would just make the money and you'd be done. But now, if you buy financial assets, they're constantly being inflated. They're making more bonds. They're making more of everything. And the money that is underlying them is being inflated. They're making more of that money. So your yield is going down further and further and further. So 10 years ago, you could have retired on $1 million interest. Today, you need something like $10 million. So people need to work harder, need to save more, need to invest more in order to just stay where they are. And that's the result of inflation. And that's, of course, something that doesn't show up in your official CPI statistics produced by your government, which is an interesting coincidence given that they are the same people that benefit from all of that inflation. So that's it for lecture 4. I'll see you next week for lecture 5.